And we're going to go on with item A, the community survey results. And Madam Superintendent.
So thank you, Madam President. As you know, we've begun exploring the possibility of pursuing an extension of the current local parcel tax measure to preserve vital programs and services for students. Part of the exploration process includes surveying members of the community to determine the level of support. And now that that polling is complete, this evening we have representatives from Traumatola Advisors and True North Research who are going to present to the board and provide an analysis of the results to determine the feasibility and the level of support for extending Measure N. I'm going to start with a little bit of background.
Is that clear? Go ahead. Did you want to start first? No, you go. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Good evening, Madam President, members of the board. I'm Dr. Tim McClarney. I am the president of True North Research, and we are a research firm that specializes in working with California school districts as well as other public agencies around the state in using surveys to develop a statistically reliable understanding of the communities that they serve. With me is Larry Traumatola, and I'm sure Larry will have some words to on the results of the survey as I go through this presentation. My business partner and I, together as a two-person team, have designed and conducted over 800 research studies for public agencies, and about 300 of those are what we call revenue measure or tax measure feasibility studies, where the goal is to understand if it's feasible to move forward with a revenue measure, and if it is feasible, how you go about structuring that measure in a way that it's consistent with what your community is wanting to support in a particular measure. To date, we've raised about $22 billion at the local level, and since the start of the recession in 2008, we've actually, which is, as you might imagine, become a more difficult time and environment in which to pass tax measures around the state. We've had a 93% success rate combined for school bonds and parcel taxes around the state. And the reason I mention that is because as I go through tonight's presentation, I may make reference to how the results that we're seeing here in Livermore Valley compare to what we typically see when we do this type of work for other school districts, and I wanted you to have a sense for my experience in the context of my references. Also, as I go through tonight's presentation, I welcome questions from the board as I go, or at the end, whichever is your preference. Okay.
Well, I'm going to start with a little bit of parcel tax measure background and what's unique to Livermore before we jump into what might be in the future. So in November of 2004, recall many of us were here, 71.6% of Livermore voters approved Measure D. So it's $120 per parcel tax measure. It was for 5 years. There was a senior exemption and an oversight committee, averaged about to $10 per month. And that went through June 2010, and that kept some vital programs and services going here in Livermore, even while there was uncertainty sometimes with the state support for economics for schools. And then in November 2008, we actually went out to renew that with a slight increase, and 76.2% of the voters approved Measure M. And that was about $138 per parcel, not about, it was exactly $138 per parcel for the 5 years again with a senior exemption and Citizens Oversight Committee. So about $11.50 per month. And that is slated to expire next June 2015, so a year from this June. And some of the vital programs and services that really came to the forefront as priorities for this community were smaller class sizes, high school counselors, middle school electives, elementary science specialists, and technology. So these were all things that our local community valued, and they felt that by giving and supporting the local district and providing those things, that we could preserve vital programs, again, even while the state had fluctuated with its funding. And so that kind of takes us to where we are now, which is the exploration phase and the current parcel tax measure. So just, I think there's a visual as well that would go. This is actually a breakdown of how the funds were spent last year. So you can see that all schools ended up benefiting, all students as they go through the system ended up benefiting. And then there's a visual for those of us who like to look at things differently. There's a pie graph in the next chart. Another way to look at it, the proportions. So we'll go ahead.
Okay. Okay, yeah. I'm not going to be able to do that from here.
The Parcel Tax helps fund technology so that we can switch the buttons and make.
What's that?
So while we're waiting for the transition, I just want to tell you that we did receive notice from some of our math count students who could not come tonight to get their second recognition. Notice they had real recognition the first time. And it's because they were studying math. I think there's a larger competition coming up. So that was very exciting news.
All right, thank you. And so I have about a 12, maybe about a 15 slide presentation here where we're going to go over the highlights of the survey results. And again, I welcome questions as I go or at the end, whichever is your preference. Before I talk about the actual results of the study, it's probably helpful to review for a moment both the purpose of the study, or the why, as well as the methodology for how we went about doing the study. In terms of the purpose, I mentioned at the outset this is what we call a tax measure feasibility study. It's really designed to do three things. The first is to answer that question of, is it feasible? And by feasible, I mean if the board were to choose to place a measure on an upcoming ballot, does it have a reasonable chance of success? You might imagine the answer to that question isn't always yes. Sometimes we look at these results, and especially when you're talking about two-thirds measures, we look at the data, and there's really no way to get you from where you are today to where you need to be successful on election day in a near term. And when that's the case, we're very frank about that. And the last thing the board wants, or staff wants, or we want, frankly, is for you to move forward with a measure that really doesn't have a reasonable chance of success. Fortunately, when it comes to schools, voters tend to place schools towards the top of their priority list in a lot of ways. And so when there is feasibility, the next purpose of this survey is to help us understand how would you go about packaging that measure in a way it's consistent with what your community wants to support. There's a lot of things that go into the package. There's obviously the price tag, how much do they view as affordable? What is it you'd be spending the money on? Right, in terms of the actual, if it were successful, how are you going to actually propose to spend the money, accountabilities that can be put into these measures, et cetera. And so that's another goal of this study, is to understand, if we're going to structure a measure in a renewal, what is it that our community is most interested in funding? And then finally, to gather information needed for communications and outreach. And I'm a big believer in, if you're an agency that's going to choose to place a measure on a ballot, it's also incumbent upon you to help educate the community about the choice that you're asking them to make. And so this survey provides some guidance in terms of what information your community needs to have in order to feel like they're well educated about the decision that is going to be put before them. In terms of methodology, this was a telephone survey, averaged about 16 minutes in length for an interview, and conducted in January this year. We spoke with 350 voters selected at random from what we call the likely June 2014 universe. What that group is voters who are not only registered to vote, but based on their voting history and their demographics, we would expect would actually cast a ballot in the primary election coming this June. That's a relatively small percentage of your total electorate. You have about 50,000 voters. About 21,000 of those voters are likely to cast a ballot in June. And so that was the sampling universe from which we drew our 350. Now, because this was a random sample and not a census of all of those 21,000 likely June voters, it has what's known as a margin of error due to sampling, and that's about plus or minus 5.2%. What this means is we can be 95% confident that the results we'll talk about tonight are within 5% of what we would have found had we spoken with all of your likely June voters. So it has about a 5% wiggle room around the results that we'll talk about tonight. Okay, on to the actual results. This first slide is what we call our importance of issues slide, and it's the first real substantive question of the survey. And for each of those issues shown on the left side of that figure, we simply ask people to tell us how important it is to them. Is it extremely important, or very important, somewhat important, or not at all important? And we've ranked them here from high to low based on the combined percentage who said it's either extremely important or very important. We asked this question early on, both because it's a good warm-up question. It gets people thinking about local issues. And it's also an opportunity for us to identify how education-related issues stack up against other issues in the community, in particular how they stack up against other issues that compete for tax dollars, as well as that issue of preventing local tax increases. And it's kind of a rough rule of thumb, but it makes sense, and that is if education-related issues stack up at the top of this list, right? They outpace the other issues that also compete for tax dollars, and there's a sizable gap in the perceived importance between education and this issue of preventing local tax increases. It bodes well for the feasibility of a measure. Why? Because they care a lot about what it is you're proposing to fund, and they care more about that than that issue of keeping their taxes low. And this is exactly the pattern that you see here tonight. Top of the list, most important issue, maintain the quality of education in local schools. You had 86% of your voters say that that's either extremely or very important to them. Second on the list there was maintaining local property values, which obviously there's a nexus between good schools and good property values. Then maintaining local streets and roads, improving public safety, on down the list. You get second from the bottom there is that issue of preventing local tax increases at 57%. So there's about a 29% gap in the perceived importance between maintaining the quality of education in local schools and preventing local tax increases. If I knew nothing else about the rest of your results, and this is always the first question I look at when we do these polling, it's amazing how well I can look at this question and say, okay, we're going to have feasibility, because this correlates really strongly when you have this kind of pattern with an electorate that's then going to go on and say, okay, I'm willing to consider some sort of a tax measure to fund schools. Now, after the importance of issues question, we go right to what we call our initial ballot test. And the idea is, before we get any deeper into this interview and we start talking in more detail about how Measure M funds have been spent, or arguments pro and con as to why someone should or should not be supportive of this measure, we present respondents with a mock-up of that roughly 75-word ballot statement, and we get their reaction. It's a really good gauge of where your community is at today on the natural with respect to a proposed parcel tax renewal. And as you can see there, the language is consistent with what you typically see on a ballot. In order to do the things that you see there in the bullets, shall the school district extend the expiring 138 school parcel tax without raising the tax rate. So the one thing we also are making clear in this ballot statement is that it's an extension of the existing 138 rate. It is not increasing it. And here are your results. Initial ballot test, you had 70% of your voters say that they would support the proposed parcel tax renewal. You had 22% who said they were opposed. You had 8% who said they were unsure. In the state of California, you need 2/3 or 66.667% in order to be successful. So right out of the gates at the initial ballot test, you're sitting about 3 points higher than that 2/3 threshold. That's a really good place to start. A lot of times when we work on these types of measures, you don't start at 2/3. You have to sort of climb hills to get to 2/3, right? You start below it and then you build support up to 2/3. So to be sitting at 70% on the initial ballot test is a really good place to be. And as you imagine, when you have 70% support, it's really widespread. There's actually only two groups, when we look at subgroups by age or gender or partisanship, or do they have children in the district, how long they've lived in the district, all of those types of subgroups, there were only two that had support that was under 60%, and you had many groups that were supporting at 80+%. Now, one of the things you find when you do this type of research is that voters will base their opinion on a measure in part based on what's in the measure, so what's it funding and what the tax rate is, et cetera, which makes sense. But the other thing you find is that they will vote on this based in part about how they feel about you as an agency. And in a lot of ways, voters are kind of like a bank in that respect, right? They want to see that you're performing well with the funds that you have and providing a good, solid education with what you have before they're willing to.
Can I just ask you to hold for one second?
Sure.
The gentleman in the back who's taking the pictures, I have an extra copy of the slides if you'd like to.
Okay.
Can we pass that down? Go ahead.
Okay. And so we ask voters about what their perception is of the quality of education provided in the Livermore Valley Joint Unified School District. And as you can see here, you had about 64% who said either excellent or good. You had about 20% who said fair. You had less than 5% who said the quality of education is poor, very poor. And you only had 10% who didn't know. sometimes in districts when we do this type of question, you'll have as many as 20 to 25% of voters who won't know enough about the school district to be able to venture an answer to this question. And so the good news is you don't have as many of those folks in that gray area as we would normally see. We also asked voters about sort of another background question and how they'd rate the school district's need for additional money. Would you say it has great need, moderate need, little need, or no need? We asked this question because that perception of need is obviously sort of a foundational perception for having a successful tax measure. If they look at you as a district and say you don't need money, then that naturally doesn't tend to correlate with them being supportive of a tax measure. And so we asked this question. You can see that 68% of your voters said that you have either a great or moderate need for funding, and that's actually on the higher side of what we've been seeing lately. Okay, sort of back to the measure. At this point, we transition to what we call our programs and projects section, and the idea here is really twofold. One is to start to educate this respondent more about what this measure would fund. Up to this point, they've only heard that 75-word ballot statement. We can only pack so many things into 75 words. And so here we get an opportunity to unpack this proposed parcel tax extension into all the types of services that it can fund and programs it can fund. And so in that way, we're starting to educate the respondent more about the measure. It's also an opportunity for us to understand, of all the things that you can fund with this, which of those do they view or they most favor you spending parcel tax proceeds on, and which of those are perhaps further down the list. One of the things that sort of jumps off this page is that everything we tested, right, had support from at least 75% of your voters. That's unusual. Usually when we ask this kind of a list, there's usually one or two programs or services at the bottom of the list that you may get 50% support for. Here you had 75% support for everything on the list or greater. The top three were continuing funding for advanced programs in math, science, engineering, and technology, so STEM, keeping schools safe and well maintained, attracting and retaining highly qualified teachers, and on down the list. What this says is, if you choose to move forward with a renewal, is you can pretty much bundle just about any combination of these services and programs into the measure, and they would be well received by your voters. Now, if the board chooses to place a measure on upcoming ballot, there's going to be an election cycle, and during that election cycle, you're going to have members of the community who are supportive of schools and supportive of this measure stand up and advocate on behalf of this measure to their neighbors and try and convince them to support it. You might also have some opponents who will stand up and try and convince their neighbors not to support this measure. So there's going to be a discussion and a debate and a dialogue that will happen during that election cycle. For this to be a reliable assessment of the community support for this proposed parcel tax renewal, we need to simulate that discussion and debate in the context of this interview so that we not only know where they're at today, which was that initial ballot test, but what happens to their support levels for your measure once they've been exposed to positive arguments as well as once they've heard negative arguments. And so on this slide, we show the positive arguments that we tested, and the nature of the question is supporters of the measure say blank, you insert a positive argument. Do you think this is a very convincing, somewhat convincing, or not at all convincing reason to support the measure? All of the arguments we tested had at least 70% of your voters say it's at least a somewhat convincing reason to support the measure. The top three were whether or not you have school-aged children, protecting the quality of our schools, the quality of life in our community, and the value of our homes as a wise investment. Second one is if we want our kids to be prepared for success in college and 21st century careers, they need to have a high-quality education, including advanced courses in math, science, technology, and the arts. And then thirdly is this concept of local money. All the money raised by the measure will stay in the district to support our students. It cannot be taken away by the state or used for other purposes. So many of these positive arguments resonate. Now at this point in the interview, voters have heard a lot more now about this parcel tax than they did originally, right? They had the initial ballot test. Since then, we've talked about in detail the programs and projects that could be funded by it. We also tested these positive arguments. So we circle back and we ask them, now that you've heard a bit more, where do you stand on this measure? As you can see, support ticks up a little bit. At this point, you're sitting at 72% of your voters saying that they would support the measure. That's about 5% above that 2/3 threshold. Now, they haven't heard the negatives yet, and that's an important part of this as well. Again, for a realistic assessment of how feasible this measure is, we also tested a series of negative arguments. And one of the things you can see when you look at the negatives is they don't resonate quite as strong as the positives did. But, you know, the concepts that, you know, it's a sluggish economy, now's not a good time to be raising taxes, or that the district really needs to live within its means, and, you know, if they cut waste, they would not have to raise taxes, or we raise the you know, that the passage of Prop 30 last November will pump billions of dollars into California schools. We don't need this tax. So we didn't pull any punches. We sort of anticipated some hard-hitting negative arguments, and we put them, bounced them off the respondents. But the real test is what happens afterwards, and that's your final ballot test. So after, on the heels of the negatives, support checks in at 71%. And so what you see actually over the course of this interview is a lot of stability in terms of your voter support for the proposed parcel tax renewal. Started out at 70%, went to 72%. Even after the negatives, it stayed at a little above that at 71%. All right, so what does all this mean? I've got a couple slides here that I'll comment on, and then I'll welcome questions again from the board. What does all this mean? Well, the first thing I will do is I'd circle back to that first question that I mentioned at the outset, which is why you do this study in the first place, which is to get a gauge of, is it feasible? If the board were to choose to place a parcel tax renewal measure on an upcoming ballot, does it have a reasonable chance of success? I think the answer to that is clearly yes. Many of the things that we want to see in place for a measure like this to be feasible are in place here. We found that voters perceived that maintaining the quality of education in local schools was the most important issue facing the community. That translated into strong natural support for your measure. Right out of the gates, we found 70% of your voters who said that they would be willing to support that $138 parcel tax renewal. All the things that we tested that you could fund with those parcel tax proceeds were popular in terms of the programs and services. The positive arguments resonated, and importantly, support remained above that 2/3 threshold throughout the poll at all of the ballot tests, even after the negatives, and that's an important thing. So again, lots of positive indicators in the poll that a measure like this is feasible. Now, having said that, it's important to recognize a couple of things about polls in general, but also about the process moving forward from here. The first thing I want to point out is that, and I always like to emphasize this when you have good positive poll results like you do here, and that is a poll is a snapshot in time, right? It's not a crystal ball looking ahead on election day and saying you're going to win at 70% on election day. It's a snapshot in time today. And the reason I mention that is because sometimes when we present very positive poll results like this, there can be a tendency for folks to go, and there's, you know, okay, we've kind of got it in the bag, and they relax, right? Or they get lazy, and they don't do all the things they need to be doing between now and election day to be successful, and they lose. So the poll is a snapshot in time. What determines what happens on election day isn't what your poll is saying today. It's the decisions this board is going to make with respect to, if you choose to put a measure on the ballot, how you go about structuring that measure in a way that is well aligned with what your community's priorities are and what they want to support. It's certainly the amount of effort and investment that happens in outreaching to your community and helping them educating them about the decision you're going to be asking them to make, and communications, as well as events, some of which you can control and some of which you can't. And so it's always, as positive as your poll results are, it's always sort of an uphill climb to election day. And I just want to emphasize that because you have great results. It's certainly a place where you'd want to be to start this climb. But it's important that you do the things you need to do to be successful. And another issue that I would point out is we tested a no tax increase extension of $138, and that's a big part of why the support levels are as high as they are. I would recommend staying with that no tax increase extension scenario. I wouldn't decide to go for a tax increase on top of the 138 at this point for the parcel tax. You would see different poll results. They'd probably be 5 to even maybe 10% lower than this. And so although the numbers are really strong, those numbers do reflect the fact that it is a no tax increase extension. In terms of election timing, this was a likely June universe. I'd recommend going in June. These numbers are strong. And then finally, as I pointed out before, you really do need to continue that sort of two parts, the district's outreach and education to the public, which is a non-advocacy function. And then at a certain point, the independent campaign can stand up. It's not district funded, but to stand up and sort of carry that effort through to Election Day once this board chooses to actually place and votes to place the measure on the ballot. So with that, I know I've done a lot of talking. I'll be quiet for a moment and see if there's any questions from the board.
All right. So, fellow board members, Dr. Dunlop.
One of my questions has to do with between now and June, there will be fluctuations. Do you come back and do additional polling to see where we are, or is that all our own job after that?
Given the aggressive timeline between now and June, I mean, sometimes what you're talking about is what's called a tracking poll, where we do a baseline poll now, and then before the board would vote to place a measure on the ballot, but after some of these communications have taken place, we would do a tracking poll to see, are we still in alignment? I'm going to not recommend that personally. I think you're close enough to this in terms of a schedule to the point that you can kind of just keep an eye on the community and engage in your communications exercise without having to come back and frankly put the expense in on a poll. I'd rather see you put that effort into communications instead. Tracking polls tend to be more important when there's a longer period of time between when we take our baseline poll. Like if this were going to be a November measure, let's say, at that point, you're not going to be, as a board, making a decision until August. And we just kind of keep an eye on how things are developing between now and August. And sometimes there is a need to do a tracking poll at that point. But with June, I think it's not necessary.
Okay, thank you.
In June, do you have any understanding or knowledge of what competing tax measures are going to be on that June? Pardon?
Alameda County.
Yeah, excuse me. I think there's only going to be one. There's going to be an Alameda County Measure AA, which is the half-cent sales tax. It is a no tax increase as well. It also requires 2/3. I think that's the only other competing tax measure on the ballot.
Isn't that one that, though, looking after 30 years instead of?
No, that's Measure BB, which will be in November.
Okay, good.
This is June, and it's Measure AA, and it's for the health care.
So the plus or minus deviation on this was what, 5%?
Yeah.
So the worst outcome could be 66.5. Given I mean, we've won. And it's still
If
at
the vote had
0.5.
taken place in January
Don't
and we
win.
would have lost, you have to have 66.7.
0.7, right.
And I can tell you that when we do bond measures and the threshold is 55%, right, it's often that will wind up with polling that will be comfortably outside that margin of error, right? So if they have 62% for a bond support and you need 55%, you have this comfort going in of knowing even if we're on the low side of our margin of error, we're still above the 55%. It's rare to have a parcel tax measure poll at 75, 78%, right, or anything like that. I mean, when you do polling for these types of measures, and Larry will test this, there's been plenty of times where we've moved forward with measures where the polling never even got to 66.67%. It got to 65%. I'm thinking like Moraga, right, is a good example of that, where it's on the bubble, right? To have 71 and 72%, it's not outside the margin of error, but you tend not to get much higher than that for 2/3 measures. So it's something to keep in mind, and it kind of underscores that statement I made at the end, which is, you know, you need to be careful about how you structure your measure. You need to invest in outreach into your community because it's not a slam dunk. They never are at 2/3.
And if I could add one thing that was a little different with us as opposed to some of our neighboring, or as compared to other folks who've gone out for similar measures, we didn't do any outreach or really public notice at all. It was just really a pulse check of where we are. The true test, I think, of what went into people's minds is the history of what we've done. But sometimes people, before they poll, will have already done some outreach, and then they do the little dipstick and poll. So this was with really nothing extraordinary by the district or any campaign folks or anything. It was almost a cold call.
Right.
Mrs. White?
Yes, I just would like to make a few historical comments here. The first was at 2004, was wildly successful. And I would suggest that part of the reason was we had not had an elementary science program the year before. So people missed it. And they knew the only way to restore it was to vote for this parcel tax. And it was a program. We didn't say hiring specialists. We talked about offering a program, which is, I think, significantly different wordsmithing. But you're the people who might really know. And we basically have had little district funding of counselors for 25 years. We've had some counselors hit or miss in the middle 90s because they wanted some school safety money. And we got safety money from the state, and so it was for counselors. And so we had a couple of counselors funded by them for a while. And maybe we've had one at each high school for a while, but not the almost adequate counseling staff that we have now. So it's really important that families know that. But I think the most important thing is in Livermore, class size is king. I mean, sometimes I visit with board members in other communities, and they think nothing of having 35, 6, 7 in a class. Our community would come unglued at that. In fact, the teachers came unglued at that in 91 too. And I just don't think that we can underestimate the power of that argument, because in Livermore, class size is king. And you've heard Ken Hall say, I'm sure, that you can have small classes and good benefits and good salaries, but only 2 of the 3. And we've always opted by community direction that we have reasonable class sizes. And of course, the other parts of the things that we've selected before were the opportunities that were provided by the electives, which also puts funding into hiring, offering 1 or 2 sections here and there, which gives an opportunity for some of the, what shall we call them, electives, visual performing arts, and those specialty classes. And I think we can clearly make the voters understand that without the parcel tax, we just won't have some of those things.
Mr. McLaughlin.
Look at all the information that you're presenting here this evening. It's just, this may happen, it may not happen, and we may have to go down another road to accomplish what we would like to do and should do for the district and for the parents of this district. And to ask, am I going to pass on the partial tax or not pass on the partial tax, I think depends on how economics and economies are going at that particular point of time. But you need to look at it with an open heart as to what's going on and where can we work with it, and ask then before we vote. Let's go out and vote.
Thank you, Tom. I want to go back to the methodology also. As a person with a degree in numerical analysis, I got to say, when I look at the confidence number, I'm surprised. And the reason I'm surprised is I guess I want to know, how has that number changed over time? If you use that same sample size of 350 10 years ago, what would the confidence number be?
It'd be the same.
And in my experience, in the 10 years, the number of people who would actually answer their phone when contacted has changed a lot.
Yeah, and that's a different, the margin of error on a poll is based on an equation which doesn't get at that issue. It's a separate issue, and it's an important one, right? It's an important one in terms of reliability, and I'll sort of talk about that in a second. But As far as just looking at, we have 350 interviews, if they're drawn on a random sample from your population, even though your population has grown a
But
bit.
it's no longer random when it's the people who will actually choose to answer the phone, and that's my worry.
And hold your thought for a second, and I'll answer that piece. But from a pure sample size perspective, let's just say the fact that your population has grown in this 10-year period of time, population plays such a minor role, right? That if you take 350 interviews, and even if your sample size, I mean, your population size has grown up, your margin of error is going to be the same now as it was 10 years ago. The issue of reliability in terms of telephone interviewing is a different question. And your point is, look, people call screen, which they do, right? Not everyone, people migrate over to cell phone numbers. Sometimes the voter file record hasn't been updated with their new information, and therefore when we're calling in, you're having to deal with that in a way that inferential statistics always thinks about reaching in and grabbing colored balls out of a bowl, right, and saying that's how you determine these probabilities. Well, the colored balls can't refuse to answer their phone or not tell you their color. And so it sort of begs the question of, well, why, how come this be reliable? The first thing I would say is that the way we pull our samples, we recognize some of these problems, but we can rely on a lot of the information that's on the voter file to adjust for this to some degree. So for example, when I said 350 selected at random, what we do is we use a process called stratification and clustering. And what that is a fancy word for is we take your likely June voter profile and we break these individuals down by a variety of different demographics: age, gender, partisanship, household party type. That's actually a really important one, right? If I knew you were a Democrat, that tells me something about you. If I know you live with another Democrat, that actually tells me a lot more about you. I'm not saying you're Democrat or Republican, but I'm just giving you an example, because what happens are Democrats and Democrats sit across the table from one another at dinner and they talk about politics and they reinforce each other's political views and that they're right, right? Republicans do the same thing. Republicans who live with Republicans reinforce each other's political indications. If you live in a mixed household, God help you, right? Or live by yourself, you tend to be more moderate. So we pay attention to all of these things: household party type, age, gender, partisanship, etc. And then we develop all of these profiles for your community such that if I know that 5% of the likely June voters in Livermore Valley Joint Unified School District are Democratic females who live with another Democrat, who are also between the ages of 50 and 65, I can make sure that 5% of the clusters in my sample represent that profile. We do that for the entire district, and then what happens is you randomly pick people into their appropriate clusters so that when I call somebody and they don't answer their phone, right, or they refuse to take the poll, I can replace them with someone who shares their exact same profile. And it's that what allows us to be so accurate, because it's not that they just call screen or don't call screen as much as it is the profile that they have as politically and demographically that really drives their voting behavior. So is it perfect? Is it what statistics tells us we should be able to do? No, it never has been. But the proof in the end is in how accurate we are, right? And our polling is, even though a lot can happen between polling day and election day, our polling is, with very few exceptions, within 3% of what actually occurs on election day in terms of the vote, when we get to pair up with Larry in terms of him doing his work as well. Because an important part of making what's in your poll actually happen on election day is the process that happens from here on out, and that's what Larry manages.
I thank you for your answer, and I'm gonna ask it again in a different way.
Sure.
I did understand what you said, and I get it. The first thing I would take off this slide is at random, because what you told me was that it was a construct rather than at random, that it's random within categories.
Then that's called stratified samples are random within certain.
Right.
It's actually improvements on a simple random sample.
My biggest concern would be that the people that are most likely to answer the phone and actually talk to you are going to skew significantly older than the people who refuse. Without seeing the data, that would be my guess.
And you're right. If we just called numbers at random, that's what would happen. Except that, as I mentioned, we have 5% of we have clusters that represent certain profiles.
Right.
And so once that profile's been satisfied with an interview, that cluster, it's the next cluster. And so if we just took random numbers, you are correct, we would not have a sample that would necessarily, and we took whoever came to the phone, we wouldn't have a true representative sample of your electorate. But that's not what we do. That's why we stratify and cluster.
Okay, thank you.
And I think we actually have some background information on not the actual names of people, but those profiles of who actually responded and all of that. And we can give that in a Friday packet too, just to kind of give you more assurances, because I think all of us probably, had that same concern about who actually participates.
Yeah, that's something we pay close attention to in terms of as not only we have that process ahead of time, and that's the neat thing about working with the voter files, we can structure this ahead of time, that we know on the backside we're going to have a sample that's within certain tolerances of what your likely June 2014 universe looks like in terms of household party type and age and gender and all of those things. And so that's the neat thing about working with voter files, whereas there's other types of surveys that are out there where random digit dial, for example, where they're choosing phone numbers at random. That's a very haphazard exercise in terms of sampling, because it runs into all those problems you mentioned and you have no way to sort of deal with it.
Right. So to put it in kind of plain language for people without a degree in math, in order to get the number of young respondents that you need in order to be relevant, you might call more of the young people than the older people because fewer of them are going to answer.
Yes, and certain demographics are easier to get on the phone than others. And so once we've satisfied certain profiles for the young voters, we will do more calling to locate them, certainly. We also, as Larry mentioned, we have the issues of cell phones too, right? And we dial both, because if you leave cell phones off, you definitely get an age skew in terms of who you can now reach, right?
Right. And then just when we go back to things that we include, I heard Mrs. White's point, and I'm sure that the information in 1991 is accurate as represented, but I didn't see that in the data that you presented, that class size was an overwhelming issue. I saw that science, engineering, technology, and math was the highest.
Yeah, I think you have what I would call an embarrassment of riches in terms of what we tested in terms of how popular it was. The fact of the matter is everything we tested in terms of how you could fund were popular. The strongest were continuing funding for advanced programs in math, science, engineering, technology. That's something that's changed over time, right? There's been a much more emphasis on STEM in recent years, and people are getting it, that's, you want to have degrees in these disciplines in order to move on and have high-paying, skilled jobs. And so that's really high. Attracting and retaining highly qualified teachers was also one that, from an intensity perspective, tested very high. But everything on this list, including manageable class sizes, had 75% or more voters say that they favor spending the money on that item. And so when I say embarrassment of riches, what I mean by that is, as a district, that gives you some flexibility in what you decide to fund with these monies. And you could probably pick and choose just about anything on that list in combinations, and it's going to be well received.
So I'm going to direct my next question to Larry, if I could. Given that information, and given the information that you told us before that you would not recommend raising the amount, which I agree with, would we want to leave the language the same, or would we want to tailor it based on the results that we have? Would we want to fund the same programs that the community is familiar with that we've been reporting on, or do we make a change to the higher polling items?
I just want to say that when you said you were going to ask me, Tim took a sigh of relief. I just want you to know. But in answer to your question, I think one of the things we're seeing in this poll, if you look at just from the broadest perspective, voters get it. You've got a great school district. You're doing good things. They want to keep it the way. They like what you're doing, and they want to keep it the way it is. They like the programs you're funding. I think we might make some tweaks in the languages. I mean, basically, it's board decision of what you want to to fund what you want to use this money for. I mean, I've always said, and I've said it to this board, is that when you look at any sort of tax measure, the most important thing we do is making sure we're clear on how the money is going to be spent, so that we can be totally transparent with voters, we can be totally honest with them in terms of how you are spending their money. So if there are some tweaks, it's not to the program of how you're spending the money, although I think if you look at how you spent the money and what voters, how they want their money spent, there is a beautiful match. We may want to tweak it a little bit. I don't think we want to change the ballot language tremendously. I think most districts, candidly, with these numbers, would be pushing the tax rate up dramatically. That's not how you all have operated as a board. I think that has served you well in the past. And in fact, it's one of the reasons I think we like working here, because there is kind of a long-term vision of what you want to do and not get way ahead of the voters. So I think we can play with the language. Just in terms of timing, just so you know, is that we have to have the ballot language, the ballot statement, the ballot language done by the let's say the first week of March. So we are in a compressed time frame to write the ballot statement, to write the resolution. We're ready to do that. But this is not a long time frame for a June election. There's a lot of decisions that have to be made fairly quickly.
And when we're talking about time frame, could you address the length of the parcel tax and your thoughts on that?
Well, you know, it's 5 years is what you have had historically. You know, I don't think if you made it 7 years because of what reasons, you could probably do that. If 5 years is appropriate to have this board or future board revisited in 5 years, I think either one is appropriate. I know there are other issues the board may want to deal with in the future, so I think being thoughtful and maybe even conservative is probably the way to go. But as I say, we rarely see poll results like this. It's really a pleasure to see it, and it's a real tribute to the teachers, the administration, you as a board, the students, and the parents,
the community,
and the community that makes this happen. I mean, it is quite rare.
Anyone want to? Yes, Mrs.
I just wanted to comment that my historical remarks had to do with the immediacy of the voters in those times who had suffered those losses.
Correct.
So they polled high with hot button issues about counselors and big classes and science program.
You know, if you look at the history of parcel taxes generally, when parcel taxes first were established, most districts were trying to do something new with it. I mean, they were trying to do, let's say, fund a science program that they didn't have, or fund counselors that they didn't have. What's happened over the last 2 decades is that because of the cutbacks in the state on a variety of measures, parcel taxes has been used to kind of backfill and to do things just that you probably should basically do. This district has always chosen to do some extraordinary things with your modest parcel tax funds, and I think that that's been a good thing. But it's a little different. So, and the first parcel tax is always the biggest challenge for any school district. Subsequent parcel taxes, voters get, as long as districts do a good job spending the money, they become much more accepting of that, and they're not so fearful of it.
And I saw that the superintendent wanted to weigh in.
So one of the other things that's unique from the polling results was that I thought was unique, I don't know, I don't have a wide range of comparison, was how many people vote by mail. And so that also gives us a compressed timeline so far as outreach.
Well, it's not the poll that gives us that information.
it's
It's the voter
voting.
file, and we're looking at in this. Although your poll reflects that and who they polled, but it's extraordinary. I mean, we're into the 60%. So 6 out of every 10 people are not choosing to vote by mail. Now that doesn't mean they vote a month early, but they just choose to send in their ballot by mail as opposed to voting in person, and that's a major change that we've seen in the last.
And then
10,
one of
15
the other
years.
things I just wanted to put into your thinking process, even if the language is very similar, one difference that has kind of been suggested to me through some of my interactions with parents is the idea that we do have other public schools that are not affiliated with the district. They're part of the charter schools. And so that this has never reached out to them and included them in a way. Some of the families that I've spoken to have personally approached me saying they have students in both systems and would be very eager to combine forces to share if there was a kind of pro rata portion. I think 9%, 8% of the students, 9% of the students, a portion of the funds, and that possibly that would be another way of having the entire community and all of the local schools supported, local public schools. So just something to think about, as that might be a difference in something that we hadn't done before. But I think we've made a lot of inroads and are kind of a different place in that way as well.
But no polling data on that question.
There was, I think there really was, not on that particular question. It wasn't.
We asked a question. We asked a question about it was whether they would support spending some of the parcel tax proceeds without an amount tied to that on charter schools, and it was about a 50-50 split. About 50 people supported it, 50% did not. I think there's a lot of confusion about what a charter school even is among a lot of voters. Those weren't around when many voters were in school themselves, and so not that that's the overriding factor in which you would make this decision. It's probably a decision that has other issues that sort of circle around it, but it's about a 50-50 split.
That's a pretty dramatic number, though. If one voter cancels out, one negative voter cancels out two positives, and we only have 50% support for adding that, that's a surprise to me. I mean, I think back when the charter school initially formed, there was a lot of discontent, I'm going to measure my words carefully, in the community about that function, but I thought we've done a lot of healing since then, but that number doesn't sound like it.
Well, I mean,
The question, actually, though, it wasn't, would you support it if charter schools were included? That wasn't the question.
no, this question is, would you support spending
It's
some
just,
of the
do you
money
think some of the
on?
money could go to them? So it doesn't mean they would vote no on it if they were included. It's just, was that a strong, was that a really high importance, or was it not very high for them? So it would be one of the things. It wasn't. So I think a different question would have had to been asked to arrive at what you're saying is, if they're included, would you absolutely vote no? And that was not the polling question. It was just a little more about, would you strongly support including them or not? And so around half, I think it was.
Right.
So, and then there were still quite a few people who said they don't know.
I think
Maybe
it's one of
you
those,
could get us the specific wording and data on that particular question, because I think that's going to be likely the most difficult question that we face on this. I think,
Right.
the timing, it seems very clear. I think a 7-year length sounds really good to me. I mean, we've had 5-year in the past. We're not asking for an increase. So a little bit more time in between having to raise money and redo this effort, I think would be a relief to everyone involved. Some stability in expected funding is really nice thing for us. But that question, I think, is going to be a
Certainly.
little more difficult to figure out.
we can get you that.
Is there anyone else who'd like to comment on this issue? If not, well, thank you, and we're going to move on.
Thank you.
Thank you.